And maybe you'd like to take your news sheet for this week, and in there you'll find the outline for this morning. And you'll know everything I'm going to say before I say it. You heard about the African pastor who was asked about his preaching method, and he says it's very simple. He says, first, I tells them what I was going to say, and then I says it, and then I tells them what I said. Well, this morning we're going to be looking at the way in which Jesus turned expectations on their head when it came to his resurrection from the dead. And we're going to use that passage that Jeanette read so beautifully to us earlier on. So if you'd like to turn to it, you will find it helpful. It's in John chapter 20. If you're using your own Bible, if you're using the church Bible, it's still John chapter 20, but I can tell you it's page 1089. So John chapter 20 or page 1089. This lady turned all the expectations about her life on their head. When she was born, she was a perfectly healthy little baby, but at about 19 months of age, she contracted some sort of illness. This was at the end of the 19th century. It was probably scarlet fever or meningitis, we're not entirely sure. What we do know is that the illness left her both profoundly deaf and completely blind. In fact, her left eye began to protrude from her head, which is why when you see pictures and portraits of her, it's normally always from the right-hand side, as you see on the screen here. As she grew up, as a child, she became frustrated and angry. And in fact, the only person who could communicate to any degree with her was a friend, another girl about the same age, who happened to be the daughter of the family's cook. But about this time, about 6 or 7 years old, a lady called Anne Sullivan, who was then in her 20s, began to teach her to communicate, or at least try to, by spelling out words on her hand. And she would put an object in one hand and try to spell it out on the other. But even this, the girl found so frustrating. And on one occasion, she was given a mug to hold. And the lady, Anne Sullivan, spelt out mug on her other hand. And in great anger and frustration, she hurled the mug down on the floor and smashed it. But one day, a breakthrough took place. And it came when she realised that the motions her teacher was making on one hand corresponded with the things that were placed in the other hand. It happened when when the teacher Anne Sullivan was running cold water across this hand, and she spelled out water on the free hand. And it was as if a dam broke. And from then on, she nearly exhausted Anne Sullivan by constantly asking her to spell out things on her hand from all the objects in the house. And communication began. And in her life, Helen Keller turned all the expectations about her on their head. She went on to become a world-famous speaker and author. She became a passionate advocate of people with disabilities and numerous other causes. She was a suffragist, she was a pacifist, and she was actually one of the first campaigners for birth control. Every expectation of this young girl was that she would probably not survive into adulthood, and if she did, she would survive as a scarred woman. But she turned out to be a woman of huge resourcefulness, and Helen Keller brought great blessing to people that she spoke to. Now, it's just the same with Easter. We have certain expectations about Easter, and it's just as if God took the natural, normal expectations that we have about life and the universe and everything else and turned them on their heads on the first Easter Sunday. And what I want to do this morning is simply to highlight what some of those expectations were and how it is that God turned them on their head. And we can see them in John chapter 20 that you've got on your lap this morning. You see, first of all, we notice that Jesus turned medical expectations on their head. Verse 1, early in the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. That's John's own code word for himself. So we're talking here about an eyewitness account. And he said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. So Peter and me, says John, started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. So what John is telling us is that he got there first. He bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there where Jesus had been wrapped, but didn't go in. Then Simon Peter, who was a bit of a bull in a china shop, he just came along and went straight into the tomb. He too saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. Now we know, of course, that their medical understanding in the first century was nowhere near as sophisticated as ours is in the 21st. But that doesn't mean to say that they were in any way unintelligent or uninsightful. They brought their best intellects to the medicine of the time. And their medicine, as ours says, dead bodies don't walk. They put this body in the ground. They'd sealed the tomb. In fact, the authorities had even put a guard on it to prevent any hanky-panky. Dead people just don't come to life again. Once you're dead, you're always dead. And there were then, and actually still are, some people who say, well, perhaps he really didn't die. Perhaps his body only kind of fainted or swooned. The trouble with that is, if you argue that Jesus only fainted or only swooned, you're asking me to believe that after a Roman flogging, from which many men died before they even got onto the cross, after being bound and nailed to a cross, after having suffered death by suffocation, because that's how people died by crucifixion, after having endured a massive loss of blood when a soldier speared his side, and even after that, after having been ripped off the cross and having grave clothes bound tightly around the body, as was their custom, he was still strong enough to move a stone from the grave entrance, which probably weighed nigh on a ton, walk 20 miles, and after that appear to his disciples in the peak of health to show that he'd overcome death in the grave. Come on. Jesus was dead. People experienced in crucifixion could see that. He was buried in a tomb. So quite apart from any advances in modern medicine, by their own medical standard and by their own medical knowledge, it told them that resurrection didn't happen. And so this expectation that dead bodies stay dead is turned right on its head by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was gone. The grave was empty. They had to come to terms with that. They couldn't deny it. Well, not only did Jesus turn medical expectations on the head, I also noticed that he turned social expectations on the head. And we can see this in verse 18. Verse 1 tells us that it was Mary Magdalene and another woman who first got to the tomb. And then verse 18, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them all the things that had happened to her. Now, in what way does this break a social convention? Quite simply this, that the biggest news in history was carried by a woman. In their society, women were downgraded. Their status in society was low. Indeed, their evidence was inadmissible in court. But Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, herself a woman with a somewhat checkered history. And she and the other woman were the people who told the news to the waiting disciples that Jesus was alive. And from that day to this, the Church of Jesus Christ has often been rescued by godly women. Women of prayer. Women who follow Christ wholeheartedly. Jesus turned that social expectation that it was the men who mattered right on its head by giving the most crucial news in the world to two women. Well, if their medical and their social expectations were turned on their head, so too were the physical expectations of what happens when somebody dies. We can see this in verses 24 and onwards. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, because he was a twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came to see them. So the other disciples told him, "Tom, we've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe you." He was saying, I want the physical evidence. So it was a week later when the disciples were in a house again and Thomas was with them this time. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be to you." And then he said to Thomas, "Okay, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hands and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Now, they knew as well as we know that you can't just appear in a locked room. You can't suddenly jump from one place to another. Although, did you notice that the Large Hadron Collider, after a 2-year upgrade, is going to be started up again soon? If you're not familiar with the Large Hadron Collider, it's the world's largest particle accelerator. It's on the Swiss-French border, and we've made some remarkable discoveries from this thing already. It's going to start up again. Well, now, at the subatomic level, we know now, they didn't know then, we know now that actually you can jump from one place to another. You can take a subatomic particle and it can appear to be in one place, but actually it turns out to be in another. That works at the subatomic level where, because of quantum physics, the rules are rather different. But at our level, where we are as human beings, you know as well as I do that if I lock the office door, the only way I can get in there is either climbing through a window or opening the door. And here is Jesus appearing in a locked room. So most things physically were the same for Jesus after his resurrection, but some were very different. To be sure, he could walk. He walked along the road to Emmaus with them. He could eat. He cooked breakfast for them. But some things were very different, like appearing in a locked room, like appearing differently to Mary, who didn't recognize him. And this appearance in front of the disciples was not in front of a gullible audience who wanted to believe he'd risen from the dead, as some people tell us. This appearance was in front of a skeptic. This was Thomas, who definitely was not going to believe until he'd seen the evidence for himself. And in fact, Paul tells us that later on Jesus appeared to 500 at one time. So Jesus turned their physical expectations of being in one place at one time right on their head. There's something very different about his body after his resurrection, even though many things are just the same. Not only did he turn physical expectations on their head, but I also notice, and for me this is one of the most compelling aspects of the resurrection, he turned their psychological expectations on their heads. They had certain mental ideas, a certain worldview, a certain framework that was completely inverted by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's go back to Mary. She is grieving. So what would be her natural psychological expectation of the moment that she goes to the grave? She would be going respectfully as one of his followers. She would come reverently as a grieving friend. She'd come with tears in her eyes because she'd lost someone very precious to her. She'd come to start getting used to the fact that he was gone, that his body was there, that it needed to be embalmed, and that perhaps her hopes of him being the Messiah had all been dashed. My friends, when we were out in Mozambique recently, we had the privilege of attending a funeral in the church where Damien and Annette, Damien is one of the missionaries we support. He and his fiancée Annette worship at First Baptist Church in Beira in Mozambique, and we were there at a funeral. Now, at this funeral, the tradition is that all of the mourners, that's all of the congregation, if it was here, it'd be you, we go to greet and to express our condolences to the family who've just lost their loved one. And that family was standing at the front, And the tradition is you greet the family and then you go past the coffin, which is open. And I should have put it on the overhead, on the PowerPoint. We joined the queue, and it was a huge queue of people coming up to the front, filing past the open coffin, condoling the mourners, and then going back to our seats. But she was there in the coffin. I saw her. So did everybody else. Meanwhile, a choir that she sang their hearts out on the other side of the building. I've got some wonderful photographs of it. Our psychological expectation was that we would console the people who were mourning, and that's what we did. But Mary discovered that the one she was expecting to embalm was missing. So Mary stood outside the tomb, verse 11, crying, and as she wept, she bent over to look in and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Now this is not a sight her mind would quickly allow her to process, yeah? Her psychological expectation was of a difficult moment, but one where she could quietly pay her respects to Jesus. But angels, and all we know is that they're dressed in white, were not on her list of expectations. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" Speaking angels certainly aren't. Why are you crying? As if they didn't know. "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." Verse 14. At this she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realise it was Jesus. Why? Because psychologically she didn't expect to see him, and maybe he looked different. He was not on the list of people that her mind would put into that place. And he asked her, verse 15, "Woman, why are you crying?" Now don't read too much into that woman. It's the word there is a normal way of addressing a lady. It's lady or madam. Why are you crying? Who are you looking for? So who might a grieving Mary think would be in the garden? Well, obviously a gardener. And verse 15 again, thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him and I'll get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And something in that voice triggered within her the awareness of who she was standing in front of. I would so love to have been a fly on the wall to hear Jesus' tone of voice at that moment. Mary. And she realised he wasn't just missing, he was alive. So you know, my friends, I sometimes wonder how I would process that. I think some of you will know that about 6 years ago we lost our 22-year-old daughter called Esther. And it was a difficult time for us, and we've always been so grateful for the way that you as a church helped us through it. In my quiet moments, I sometimes wonder, when I'm studying the resurrection, how I would feel if what happened to Jesus happened to her. Suppose one day I heard the key go in the front door lock in our house. And I heard that door open, and the way that Esther always used to greet us when she came in, she'd go, "Hello." Suppose I heard that again. My mind wouldn't be able to compute it, I don't think. It would feel like psychological nonsense. So I'm sure I'd try to come up with some alternative way of explaining it, or alternative way of processing it. You know, was I seeing a ghost? Well, the disciples thought that. Is this a double? Is it someone who just looks and sounds like Esther? Well, disciples seem to think that too. Or are my eyes playing tricks on me? The disciples certainly thought that. And I'd want to touch her, and see if she was real. That's where Thomas was, isn't it? So actually, the reaction of the disciples here seems entirely consistent with people who are struggling to come to terms with something that's way outside their psychology, their mental framework on the world. And it wasn't just Mary who struggled with this, or Thomas. Look at verse 8. Finally, the other disciple, that's John himself, who reached the tomb first, went inside. He saw and believed, but they still didn't understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. I think that's so fascinating. They believed, but they didn't quite understand. They believed the evidence, it was plain, the body was missing. But they couldn't quite grasp the enormity of what it meant, that Jesus was alive, that death had been defied. The way they thought the world functioned, their worldview, didn't allow them to comprehend it at that moment. I don't know about some of us here this morning. You might be like that. Acknowledging that somebody has come back from the dead just doesn't quite compute. But let me share a little bit of mathematics with you. Sorry. Those of you who know me will know I'm quite keen on maths. When we do proofs in mathematics, there's a whole variety of different things that you can prove. One of the things that we sometimes have to prove is an existence theorem or a non-existence theorem. Suppose you're given a problem. Your first step in solving it is to prove that the solution does exist. Otherwise, you're on a fruitless search. Now, it is possible to prove that something doesn't exist, to prove there is no solution to that problem. I won't give you an example, that would be boring. But it's possible that kind of situation does arise in mathematics. And if you find yourself needing to prove a non-existence theorem, and you work at it, and you find it hard to do, at that point you have to say to yourself, maybe it can't be proven. Maybe there is one. Maybe there's one that does exist. And you only have to find, there may be an infinite number of solutions to this problem or equation or whatever it is. You only have to find one solution to know that your assertion that it can't be proved is false. Yeah? You only need one counterexample. Now, our theorem is people who are dead don't rise again. But supposing there's just one. Supposing there's just one person for whom this has happened, then that whole concept has to be put into question. And that's what's happening here. They had worked with the assumption that dead people don't rise from the dead. And here is Jesus standing before them as alive as they've ever seen him. And some of us might be like that this morning, acknowledging that to acknowledge that someone comes back from the dead might not compute very easily. But if that's you, my friend, I think I'd say to you, just take a look at the evidence, if nothing else. Take a look at the evidence that they had. And not just the evidence from the accounts at the time, but the evidence of the effect that has had in the lives of people ever since, including most of the people here in this room. And ask yourself, as I've had to ask myself, is this man worth following? Because if he is, then he's worth handing my life over to. It's worth me allowing him to be my Lord and my Master and actually following him, modelling my life on his. And as soon as he hears a yes to that question in our minds, we find ourselves in a place where he's active in our lives. We find forgiveness and peace with God. We find a new direction in life. And I can stand here, my friend, saying, that happened to me. For me, it happened to get me into the ministry. It won't do that to you, very likely. But it will give you a new direction and a new hope and a new confidence that God is with you. So Jesus turned their psychological expectations on their head. And I noticed too that Jesus turned religious expectations on their head. And I want to just kind of say a couple of things about religion. Religion is a kind of slippery thing, but it does tend to be dominated by two particular ideas. And the first idea is this. Religion says, if I do something here, I'll get something out there. If I do something for God now, he'll do something for me later on. So I might go to church, I might say prayers, I might light candles, I might go to mass, I might go through all the sacraments and all that, in the hope that if there's any sort of just God out there, he'll be kind to me when I need him. Yeah? It's a bit like sort of spiritual club card points. And I kind of amass them in the hope that one day I'll be able to cash them in. Now that kind of religion takes no account of the way that God actually works. Because that's me trying to please him. The way God works is the opposite. It's him coming for me. That's why Jesus told the parable of the lost son, for example. It's God seeking out people like us to rescue us and to renew us and to bring us salvation. True Christianity has God taking the initiative. And that's what we see here. You see, had Christianity been a religion, when Jesus appeared to Thomas, he would have comforted the disciples and then dealt with Thomas. Because Thomas is the misfit. He's the one who doubts. And I don't like doubters. No. Instead of that, Jesus said, peace be to you. Don't be worried, guys. It's basically the contemporary paraphrase. But immediately he turned to Thomas and he targeted Thomas. And he said, Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and trust. Stop doubting because the evidence is there on which you can rely. Be confident about it, Thomas. So the first idea is that I do something to get something out of God. That's not what we see here. We see God acting to reach and to rescue Thomas. But the second underlying idea behind religion is believing something that you can't verify, and by so doing demonstrating your gullibility. Do you get what I mean? You believe something that's a bit off the wall, and that shows you're a little bit weak in the head, really. But that, if that's what floats your boat, then fine. But that's the attitude that we get in society a lot at the moment. If Christianity is your thing, fine. Mine happens to be motor racing. If Christianity is your thing, well, that's all right. Mine happens to be reading novels. It's one thing against another. Everything is comparative or relative. And if you believe in Christianity, well, most of it is a load of fairy tales anyway, and really it just shows you're a bit weak in the head. It demonstrates your gullibility. But that's not what we see here. What we see here is Jesus meeting with Thomas, and Thomas saying, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, verse 29, you can see it, because you have seen me, you have believed. How much blessed, happy to be envied are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. That's us. And one thing I find thrilling about this passage is that Jesus didn't condemn Thomas. He didn't say, Thomas, you're sinful to doubt. Basically, Jesus said, Thomas, it's okay to question. I'm going to give you the evidence. He never accused him or castigated him for his unbelief. He did urge him to believe, and that's what I'm urging you to do. And my friend, if you're sitting here this morning, skeptical, unbelieving, then Jesus Christ sees you in the same way that he saw Thomas. And he says to you, my dear child, here's the evidence. Take the hint, listen to my voice deep within your heart, follow me. And you'll find that I'm the one who brings salvation and renewal. I'm the one who brings peace with God. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus turned religious expectations on their head. And then finally, I noticed that Jesus turned personal expectations on their head. I'm not sure you got that in your notes. Can't remember. Verse 30, the person changes of the writer slightly. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus genuinely is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John could hardly put it clearer. Why did he write his gospel? What's his personal motive? Now, we might expect the gospel writer to have a personal motive of recording history, because there's no question that this history was remarkable. But here, he turns our personal expectations of a history book on their head, and he said, look, this is not here just to recall events. There's an inescapable logic to my case here. What you have heard today and what you've seen in my book, what I've written up for you about Jesus' resurrection and his appearing to Thomas, is only the tip of the iceberg. There were many other signs done in the presence of his disciples. That includes me, says John. Many other signs done in the presence of his disciples, not done in secret before a chosen audience of gullible people. They were done in the presence of his disciples. And actually the signs that John is talking about here is not just the events surrounding the resurrection. He's calling on us to draw a conclusion from all of Jesus' miracles and his teaching. In fact, the Gospel of John, if you care to read it through, it'll only take you about half an hour. If you read it right through, you'll find he frames his whole Gospel around 7 remarkable signs of Jesus. John actually doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs because they point to a much greater reality of who Jesus is and what he does for us. From that day to this, Jesus has been turning personal expectations on their head. And that is why, my friends, I find it so intellectually consistent to follow him. I find it personally consistent to follow him. Because here is someone who was dead and is alive again. And in a day when more Christians are being killed for their faith than in many other times in history, we need to know that following Christ is not always a straightforward business. We have it so easy here in the West. That as we walk with Christ, and if you've never followed, not taken a first step, I'd encourage you to do it today. And I'll give you an opportunity to do it in a moment. As we take our first step, or our 74,222nd step with Christ, he's the one who is alive and with us. He's the one who transforms. He's the one who gives peace with God, even if life gets tough. Let's bow our heads in prayer.